This lecture continues our examination of classical conditioning applications, or how classical conditioning is used and how it affects our day-to-day lives. Now, in previous lectures, we looked at the fact that classical conditioning started essentially with Pavlov, or at least our modern understanding of it. And he looked at pairing neutral stimuli with reflexes. Then we fast forwarded about 20 years in time to John Watson, who turned an important corner and showed that classical conditioning is actually the basis of almost all human emotion. We're only born with about 7, potentially 8 primary, what we call primary emotions, and the rest of the emotions that you experience on a day-to-day basis, greed, lust, well, no, lust is actually kind of primary, but fear and anxiety, all of these are classically conditioned into being over tens of thousands of pairings. And we looked at the example of little Albert and how John Watson inculcated a phobia into little Albert. And then we expanded that to look at how all anxiety and fear-based diagnoses in abnormal psychology are really just outgrowths of this classically conditioned process. And then we looked at the flip side of that in using extinction in classical conditioning on how to treat anxiety and arousal-based disorders. Now, let me bring it into more of a less clinical, more of a kind of sociological or larger scale kind of issue. And that is the question, we're still dealing with conditioned emotional responses of hate. And let me go ahead and share my screen. And in this case, what we're going to look at is prejudice and hate. And we're going to look at a couple of examples and how that plays out and what the principles involved are. So one of the things to recognize is that there's nothing special about fear. Fear is just one emotion out of many potential emotions. And just in the same way that little Albert learned how to fear the rat, we have learned how to fear many things. That's what phobias are all about. There's so many phobias that it's impossible to memorize all the name. Well, just in the same way that nearly everybody has or knows somebody with a phobia, nearly everybody has or knows someone with some level of prejudice and antipathy towards groups. Now, the common conceptualization for hate is that it's ignorance, that if somebody were simply more aware of or had more context for another group, then that would get rid of a lot of the prejudice. This is wrong. Hate is not based in ignorance implies a lack of knowledge. Knowledge has nothing to do with this. Prejudice and hate actually come from classical conditioning. Just in the same way that you can't logic somebody out of an emotion, you cannot reason someone out of their religion, you cannot didactic someone out of their political affiliation, you cannot educate someone out of their prejudice. But we keep trying to do it, and we keep thinking that since it's rooted in ignorance, that education is the answer. And it turns out that this is simply not the case. There are interventions after interventions, you know, in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, where they would try to put different disparate groups together, either racially or class-wise, and have them spend time with each other, and then, you know, figuring that time spent with each other would make them walk away with less prejudice. Turns out that they actually became more prejudiced as a result of that because of the classical conditioning factors, those paired emotional responses. Education then is not sufficient. And to really understand why that is and where that might come from, let me just show you a couple of pictures to illustrate what we're talking about. The first is a picture of essentially 9/11. This is what we're going to do is we're going to look at the classically conditioned factors in this photograph. Now, there are a few things that I want you to notice. The first is the actual picture of the Twin Towers. Now, I know for many of the younger people in the class and the audience, this would be history. And so it would be not very emotionally evocative. But if you can put yourself in that time and place where these two planes had just crashed into, these very famous landmarks in New York, seeing thousands of people dying, seeing people jumping to their deaths from collapsing buildings. Unless you're a sociopath, this brought up some feelings, horror and anger and sadness and fear, a whole mixture of different kinds of arousal-based emotions. Now, if we look at this picture, let's pick it apart, because this is a classically conditioned stimulus, or this picture has elements that can be classically conditioned. The first is, remember, you need an unconditioned stimulus, something that you naturally respond to, and an unconditioned response as the reflex. And that would be here, the actual video footage of the airplanes slamming into the buildings and people dying. And if you are watching this in real time, there's confusion, there's anger, there might be fear, sadness, a whole mix of arousal-based negative emotions. Now, on top of this, we've got several, so the unconditioned stimulus here would be the actual footage of the 9/11 attacks. The unconditioned response would be that negative emotion, those arousal-based emotions. Now, in this picture, we've got some neutral, or what would previously be neutral stimuli. We have someone who looks to be Muslim, and we have some Arab-looking symbols. Now, if you're familiar with it, this is actually the symbol for Al Jazeera, the news network. And this is actually just a newscaster. You have quotes from the Quran. And you even have subtle things like the world behind bars in a cage. Now, all of these together combine, you've got the unconditioned stimulus of this kind of traumatic presentation paired with someone who's Muslim, airplanes, Arab-looking symbols, and the Quran, and you can start to see where there would be salient conditioned stimuli, previously neutral stimuli, that would start to get attached to this. Now, this doesn't mean that this fellow has anything to do with the responses or the, rather the causes of 9/11. As a matter of fact, he's just a newscaster, but he fills the role of a neutral stimulus that's being paired with the unconditioned stimulus. So just serendipitously, we're going to have a number of different stimuli that are paired with this unconditioned stimulus. And that will lead us to a series of conditioned emotional responses. Now, one of the things that happens, just in a way that it happened with little Albert, remember in the little Albert experiments, John Watson presented little Albert with the rat, and then he presented him with other stimuli that were similar to the rat. So if he presented him with the rat, then when he presented him with a bunny, the bunny would have been very close to the rat, rodent, white, and it would have evoked a fair amount of that same fear reaction. If we're going with hate and prejudice, then we're going to go through a similar generalization curve. And any group of people that share characteristics that are similar to the conditioned stimulus are going to generalize, just like the rat generalized. So if we take this and we look at the repetition over time, we see that we're bombarded with a bunch of kinds of images. For example, this is a picture of an insurgent, a Taliban insurgent, and he's holding up, he's got the headdress of the Taliban, and he's holding up what's clearly a Quran and an RPG. A lot of people will have had many previous pairings of people who appear to be Muslim or having to do with Islam and have gone through this generalization curve, and this will serve to reinforce that generalization curve so that the more you pair the Quran with these terrorists, the more that you pair somebody who is Middle Eastern or, you know, one of a number of different salient stimuli, you're going to have that conditioned emotional reaction. Now, this plays a part in prejudice and hate in subtle different ways. In your book, for example, it talked about World War II and how people tended to lump people of Chinese descent who were our allies during World War II with people who were of Japanese descent because they looked like each other. And in this case, they would attribute qualities to people of Chinese descent that the prejudice against Japanese people, since they were our enemy at the time, were seen as, for example, cowardly or underhanded or sneaky. And it led to a lot of prejudicial behavior towards Chinese or Chinese immigrants. In the same way, when 9/11 happened, and even unto today, one of the minority groups in the United States that gets targeted a lot with this conditioned emotional response are Sikhs. Now, the Sikh religion has nothing to do with Islam. As a matter of fact, you know, Sikhs often are fighting against Islam in many of the fronts in the Middle East and in Asia. And the United States has a fairly sizable Sikh population. They wear turbans or headdresses, and they grow beards, and they have a lot of stimulus features in common with things that we have previously generalized from this concept of enemy. And it turned out that after 9/11, Sikhs were getting, you know, bricks thrown through their shop windows and often beat up on the street because people assumed that either they were Muslim or had such a conditioned emotional response to their presence that they categorized them as Muslim, at least emotionally, if not in fact. And even when people were educated on the difference between Sikhs and Muslims, this did not decrease the conditioned emotional reaction they had towards this minority group because the stimulus features were so similar to each other that it really didn't matter. Again, you cannot educate someone out of a classically conditioned response because classical conditioning is so primitive, and education takes place in our frontal lobes that the two parts of our brain, the two automatic reactions, just don't talk to each other that much. And that's where we're going to end it today. Let me see if I can stop sharing my screen. Next, we're going to look at how this applies. We looked at now fear and anger and hate and prejudice. The next lecture is going to deal with more positive-based emotions, in particular fetishes and sexuality.